Let's begin with a quote, one of my favorite ones from Zoroaster. With an open mind, seek and listen to the highest ideals. Consider the most enlightened thoughts. Then choose your path, person by person, each for oneself. In the mid-7th century, Arab armies stormed across Persia and extinguished the sacred fires of the Zoroastrian temples that had burned for centuries. The Battle of Nabahand in 642 CE, lauded by victors as the victory of victories, dealt a fatal blow to the Sasanian Persian Empire and paved the way for the Islamization of Iran. Once the dominant faith of a vast region, Zoroastrianism rapidly waned under the new rulers. But what if Nahawand went the other way? What if history had taken a different turn? I want you to imagine a Middle East where the sacred fire altars of Ahura Mazda still blaze in those grand temples, where good thoughts, good words, and good deeds remain the guiding ethos of empires, and where kings invoke the Zoroastrian god's blessing instead of the name of Allah. We are going to engage in a little bit of historical speculation, remaining within respectful bounds, of course. It is simply a question of what would the Middle East be like if it had stayed Zoroastrian? It is a question born from genuine curiosity, and curiosity after studying quite an interesting spiritual tradition that is Zoroastrianism. So if you'll spend the next hour and a half to 2 hours with me, we can attempt to dig into that question together. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. I am your host, and if you are new here, I invite you to subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Also, you don't have to worry about mid-roll ads on this channel. I know YouTube's notorious for them now, but consider this your little sanctuary away from them, because all of our ads are turned off. It's far better that we are supported by our audience through Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through PayPal and Super Chats, and also the merch store. But the best thing you can do for us is like, comment, subscribe, hit the hype button, tell your friends, all those little algorithm-boosting things. Now, all introductions out of the way, let's begin. Now, I would not blame you for being a bit of a stranger to the Zoroastrian tradition, and if my introduction didn't explain it very well, let me just tell you the main parts of what you need to know. For 1,000 years before Islam, Zoroastrianism, which is sometimes called Mazda Yasna or Mazda worship, was the dominant faith of the Iranian world. It was founded by the prophet Zoroaster, sometimes called Zarathustra, in the ancient Iranian plateau, perhaps as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. Zoroastrianism became the state religion of successive Persian empires, and so from the Achaemenid Empire from 550 to 330 BCE through to the Parthian era into the Sasanian Empire 224 to 651 CE, Zoroastrian fire altars and priests called magi held pride of place in the imperial ideology. As for the Sasanian kings, well, they in particular portrayed themselves as divinely sanctioned by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism, and closely aligned, of course, with the fire temple cult. Society itself was structured around Zoroastrian ideals. According to our historical sources, which we don't have as many as we'd like to, but we have enough to piece a few things together, Sasanian society was divided into 4 classes. Now that's the priests, the warriors, the scribes, and then the farmers and artisans. And all of this reflected a cosmic order and social hierarchy influenced by Zoroastrian teachings. The priestly class, or the magi, carried immense political influence at the Sasanian court. essentially forming the upper stratum of society alongside the monarch. Now, this intertwining of church and state meant that Persian governance, culture, and law were deeply infused with Zoroastrian values. Now, one must understand too that Zoroastrianism is not like the monotheistic traditions that we generally have now in a Western sense, or even indeed in the modern Middle Eastern sense. Rather, it was a dualistic faith, centered on the cosmic battle between good and evil. Its theology, codified in the sacred texts of the Avesta, proclaims an eternal opposition between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, epitome of truth and light, and Angra Mainyu. Now, Angra Mainyu was the bad guy, the destructive spirit, the embodiment of all that is evil and dark in the world. Humans are expected to actively choose the side of good through righteous thoughts, words, and deeds. Now, notably, Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, admired the Persians' devotion to truth. He observed the Persian youth were taught to ride, draw the bow, and to speak the truth as their chief education. Telling a lie was deemed to be the most disgraceful thing in the world by Persians, a reflection of the Zoroastrian principle of Asha, which is truth or cosmic order being paramount. This cultural emphasis on honesty and virtue, reinforced by religion, set the Persians apart even in the eyes of their Greek rivals. But things changed. By the 6th century CE, on the eve of Islam's rise, the Middle East religious landscape was a tapestry of faiths. But that didn't mean that Zoroastrianism was not dominant in the Iranian realms. The Eastern Roman or the Byzantine Empire in the Levant and Anatolia was at this time staunchly Christian, whether that be Chalcedonian or Miaphysite, and various Christian sects like Jacobites and Nestorians, as well as Jews, lived under Sasanian rule in Mesopotamia and Persia. There were also pockets of Buddhists, pagans, especially towards Central Asia, and crucially, Arabia to the south was not yet Muslim. It was rather a mix of indigenous polytheism and a few Christian and Jewish communities peppered here and there. Zoroastrian Persia, however, was the superpower of the Eastern Middle East, vying only with Byzantium for regional dominance. Despite intermittent persecution of minorities, particularly when religious identity tangled with politics, let's think about Christians under Persian rule during the wars against Christian Byzantium, things like this. Despite all that, the Sasanian Empire often accommodated a mosaic of beliefs. Let's take, for example, Nestorian Christian churches and Jewish communities generally operated under Sasanian tolerance, albeit they had to pay a tax or face pressure during wartime, a precedent that would later have echoes in Islamic policy with the jizya tax for non-Muslims. Still, Zoroastrianism was the official state religion. No one could deny that. And a core of Persian identity, too. Emperors like Khosrow I, reigning 531 to 579, patronized the great fire temples, such as the legendary Adur Kushnasp temple, sacred to warriors and kings, and celebrated Zoroastrian festivals with grandeur, too. The major festivals of Nowruz, the Persian New Year at the spring equinox, and Sadeh, the midwinter festival, were national celebrations. In fact, sources describe Persian kings observing Nowruz at the fire temple at Adur Kushnasp with elaborate rites. And by the way, Nowruz has such deep roots that it is still celebrated across West and Central Asia to this very day. Its Zoroastrian origin is still quite evident in that it remains the holiest and most joyful festival of the Zoroastrian year, marking the renewal of light and life, in layman's terms, a big old party. But by the early 7th century, Zoroastrian Persia had reached a pinnacle, but also a precipice. Once you get to the top of the mountain, there's only one way to go. Decades of war with Byzantium, the Roman-Persian wars that had raged for centuries, took their toll, and finally climaxed into a brutal final conflict of 602 to 628 CE that exhausted both empires. The Persians under Khosrow II had actually captured Jerusalem and Egypt, albeit briefly. They were driven back by Emperor Heraclius. Economically and militarily drained, the Sasanian state was internally fracturing. Court intrigues, overtaxation, and plagues all weakened the empires. And so in 628, Khosrow II was overthrown and killed by his own nobles. What followed was a series of short-lived rulers, and the imperial structure teetered. Yet the Zoroastrian establishment and Persian cultural life remained intact. The empire, though weakened, still commanded loyalty, and the sacred fires still burned. No one in Ctesiphon, the capital, could have predicted that within just 20 to 25 years, their good religion would be fighting for its very survival. And then came the pivotal turning point, and the reason for our video, and that is the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula and the subsequent Muslim-Arab conquest of the 7th century. In our timeline, this was the event that broke Zoroastrian dominance. After the Prophet Muhammad's emergence in Arabia around 610 CE and the unification of Arab tribes under the banner of Islam, Muslim forces burst forth from the desert with unexpected force and fervor. Persia, still reeling from its recent turmoil, faced an enemy unlike any previous foe, one inspired by religious zeal and emerging from a quarter long considered peripheral. Well, the confrontation unfolded in a series of decisive battles. The Persians initially underestimated the threat, but defeats mounted quickly. The Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 in Mesopotamia, and the aforementioned Battle of Nahavand in 642 in Iran proper, sealed the fate of the Sasanian power. At Nahavand, though Persian forces heavily outnumbered the Arabs, clever tactics led the Sasanian army into a deadly trap in mountain defiles, and the result was a disastrous defeat. Almost 100,000 Persians lay dead. Iranian resistance did not immediately cease. The last emperor, Yazdegerd III, became a fugitive, seeking help from distant allies, but by 651, he also met his fate. The Arab conquest of Iran was well and truly complete, and with it, 400 years of Sasanian rule thrown into the dustbin of history. Of course, the meat in the sandwich is Zoroastrianism, and the impact on the religion was immense and rapid, though not quite instantaneous. In the immediate aftermath, Islam became the new official religion, and the society began its gradual process of Islamization. Arab Muslim rulers of the Rashidun Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphates initially showed a degree of pragmatism. They didn't force all the Persians to just convert overnight. There's no way that was going to work. Instead, non-Muslims, including Zoroastrians, were classified as dhimmis, or, in English, protected peoples. Though, an important caveat is that early Islamic law was uncertain whether Zoroastrians counted as people of the book, that is, possessors of an earlier divine scripture like Christians and Jews. The Quran did not explicitly mention Zoroastrians. Some Muslim jurists gave them an analogous status. Others did not. Ultimately, the prevailing view treated Zoroastrians as a tolerated but distinctly inferior class to the Muslim. They could keep their religion, sure, as long as they paid for the privilege, that jizya poll tax levied on all non-Muslims. They also had to accept a subordinate social position. If you wanted to get anywhere in life, basically, you had to convert. Kind of like saying, you've got the freedom to starve to death. You've got the freedom to always be a second-class citizen. Yeah, what kind of freedom is that? In any case, despite no immediate mass forced conversion, the pressure applied from the outset was very strong, and over the next few centuries, many Persians simply embraced Islam. Some did it sincerely. Most of them probably did it to escape the jizya and social discrimination and to fully participate in public life. The historical record notes episodes of persecution, too. Zoroastrian temples were often destroyed or converted into mosques by the early Muslim emperors. And Zoroastrian conquerors, not emperors, and Zoroastrian worship was curtailed by laws forbidding public rites that offended Islamic sensibilities. Now, for example, a pretty blatant one of that was the exposure of the dead in the Towers of Silence. That was frowned upon, as were certain purity rituals. If you don't know what the Tower of Silence is, basically when someone dies in Zoroastrianism, they take them out to this tower and just expose them to the elements, basically giving their body back to nature. You know, from, what's the quote from the Bible? From dust you came, and to dust you will return. Something like that. In any case, it's all relevant. Now, over time, many Zoroastrian sacred fires also died out. In fact, even the great fire of Adur-Gushnasp, which had miraculously survived the initial onslaught, it reportedly kept burning well into the Islamic era, was finally extinguished by about the 10th or 11th century amid renewed waves of persecution. A local Muslim ruler built a palace atop its ruins, a potent symbol of the old replacing the new, the new replacing the old, you know what I mean. In any case, large numbers of Zoroastrians fled Persia entirely during this period, taking their religion with them too. By the 8th and 9th centuries, groups of Persian Zoroastrians set sail across the Arabian Sea, and they found refuge in India. Now, these refugees, known as the Parsis, were welcomed by Hindu kings in Gujarat and allowed to practice their faith freely. They kept the flame of Zoroastrianism alive in a foreign land, and are the direct ancestors of the modern Parsi community in India. And before we move on, I'm just going to go and tell you a little story. So, the legend has it that when the Zoroastrians landed in Gujarat, well, they were not initially welcomed with open arms. Well, the king came down and said, "Listen, we're full. You gotta get out of here. Go somewhere else. We don't care where you are." The Zoroastrian leader had turned around and said, "Listen, if you let us in, we won't cause any trouble." "Oh, no, we're full. You need to get out of here." So, the legend goes that they went to their suppliers and they got a jug of milk. And the jug of milk was full to the brim. He says, "You see this jug of milk? It's full, right?" He says, "Yes." And then they got a bag of sugar and they put it into the milk, and rather than displacing any of the milk, it actually just sweetened it. It dissolved inside and sweetened it. And then they asked him to drink the milk, and he said, "It's sweeter this way, isn't it?" "Yes, it is." And it was that gesture that so impressed the king of Gujarat that he allowed them to settle there. They just weren't allowed to marry any of the local people and had to keep to themselves. But still, it's a nice story that I've always liked. I retell it every chance I get. Well, anyway, meanwhile in Iran, those who remained became a shrinking minority, often clustering in more remote areas like Yazd and Kerman, where they could maintain their communal life. And by around the 9th to 10th century, Muslims likely became the majority in formerly Zoroastrian Persia, completing the religious transformation. Now the decline was steep. Zoroastrianism went from being once numbering in the millions to a faith with mere thousands over the next millennia. And today, there's only about 150 to 200,000 Zoroastrians remaining worldwide, a tiny remnant of what was once one of the world's great religions of antiquity. And that reality just shows how dramatic the Islamic conquest was. The Middle East did not stay Zoroastrian. Instead, it became overwhelmingly Muslim, with Persia eventually adopting a new Persian Islamic identity, especially after the Iranian intermezzo and later Safavid dynasty enforced Shia Islam. Persian language and culture did survive, however, albeit adapted to Islamic rule. And notably, Persians reasserted themselves politically within a few centuries. The Abbasid Caliphate saw a strong Persian influence, and indigenous Persian Muslim dynasties did rise up too. But the religion of Zoroaster was relegated to the sidelines. So here we are at the question, what happens if we reverse the outcome? What if the 7th century battles had gone differently? And what if the Sasanian Empire repelled the Arab invaders and Islam never spread beyond Arabia? Could Zoroastrianism have remained the dominant religion of the Middle East well into the medieval period and indeed to our modern era? We'll venture into this alternate history. We'll try and use the known historical context as a bit of a springboard too. And we will assume a point of divergence. Let's say Emperor Yazdegerd III and his generals managed to decisively defeat the Muslim Arab armies, perhaps at Nahawand or Al-Qadisiyah, holding the Islamic conquests before it even managed to grow. The Arabian Muslims, faced with defeat, either retreat and remain a regional power in Arabia, or dissipate. Islam might persist in Mecca or Medina, but without the spectacular conquests, it does not become the mass religion of West Asia. Instead, the Persian Empire survives, and Zoroastrianism remains the state religion of Iran and possibly neighboring regions that historically fell to Islam. What would that look like? Let's talk about it. In a Zoroastrian-dominated Middle East, the politics would have been markedly different from the caliphates and sultanates that we know. Presuming the Sasanian Empire or its successor endures after repelling the Arabs, the region might have been unified, or at least centered around a Persian imperial state for longer. Now, this would have multiple implications. First, a continued monarchy with divine kingship. The Sasanian model of governance was a hereditary monarchy with strong claims of divine sanction. The Shahanshah, king of kings, was seen as ruling by the grace of Ahura Mazda, often described as possessing Kavarena, divine glory or fortune, a quasi-magical mandate of heaven, but in Zoroastrian terms. Now this is in contrast to the Caliphate, where leaders were chosen as successors of the Prophet, initially elected or selected from Muhammad's tribe, and later becoming hereditary in dynasties like the Umayyads and Abbasids. A surviving Persian empire would likely have continued the tradition of royal cults and coronation rituals at fire temples. And so we might imagine an unbroken line of Persian kings, tracing lineage perhaps to the Sasanian house, or a new dynasty that claims the legacy of legendary kings Jamshid or Cyrus, as recorded in the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings. The stability, or perhaps instability, of succession would depend on internal politics. And of course, one can surmise that the Zoroastrian clergy or the Magi would play a powerful role in legitimizing or challenging kings, just as the Islamic ulema and Caliphate court did in the real timeline. Historically, Sasanian high priests sometimes clashed with kings or even instigated coups, and this dynamic might continue. It's pretty realistic to assume so, and that once again makes politics a dance between throne and altar, rather than throne and mosque. Now here's the next thing. Obviously, there would be no Rashidun or Umayyad Caliphate. The expansion of the Arab Islamic Caliphate, which by 750 stretched from Spain to Central Asia, would have been completely averted. Instead, Arabia might remain mostly autonomous, or perhaps even a vassal region. It is possible that a victorious Persia might impose influence over parts of Arabia, perhaps Persian vassals in Yemen or along the Gulf Coast, as indeed pre-Islamic Persia had some influence in Yemen. Islam, if it still arises under Muhammad's preaching, could remain regionally significant, but in political terms it would be completely contained. Let's think of one scenario. The early caliphate still forms in Arabia, but after military defeat, it turns inward, perhaps focusing on consolidating the Arabian Peninsula. Over time, without vast new territories, Islam could evolve more as a small regional religion, somewhat akin to how, let's say, Manichaeism, something like that, and other movements, ones that kind of flared up and then fizzled out. Now, alternatively, Persian rulers might attempt to co-opt or suppress Islam, maybe by supporting Arab allies opposed to the new faith, or by patronizing Christians in Arabia to counterbalance it. The historical record does show that Zoroastrian Persians were not strongly missionary in their approach, but they did engage in power politics, that's for sure. Just one example. In the 6th century, the Persians backed a vassal king in Yemen who actually practiced Judaism as part of the proxy wars against the Christian Byzantine influence. Well, in our alternative timeline, a Persian Shah might find it useful to prevent the spread of Islam by supporting alternative elites in Arabia. We could imagine that no Islamic Caliphate entered Damascus or Baghdad. Instead, perhaps a Persian governor in Mesopotamia just as before, along with a patchwork of smaller states elsewhere. The next thing we have is the Persian and Byzantine rivalry continuing. It was one of the major political theaters of the ancient world, well, the almost medieval world, the Persian Empire and the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire. In reality, the Arab conquests removed the Sasanian Empire entirely, and they stripped the Byzantines of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, transforming Byzantium into a smaller medieval Greek state. And in our scenario, those Byzantine territories, well, they might not fall so easily. You see, the 7th century war between Persia and Byzantium had just ended with Persia temporarily humbled. Heraclius had struck deep into Persia. If Persia managed to rebound and stop the Arabs, it may or may not attempt to reclaim lost ground from Byzantium. And there is a plausible outcome, where, recognizing the mutual exhaustion, Persia and Byzantium settled into a prolonged Cold War, or perhaps even a truce. The threat of Arab invasion could ironically push the two empires into a détente, or even an alliance. For example, the Persians might allow Byzantium to retain the Levant, while they focus on defending their core. Conversely, freed from Arab threat, a revitalized Persian king might renew offenses westward once more, especially if a king like the hypothetical new Khosrow III arises. If Persia managed to conquer parts of the Near East, think about Syria, or even as far down as Egypt, those areas might have seen Zoroastrian rule instead of Islamic rule. However, it's equally, if not more likely, that those predominantly Christian regions would remain under Christian Byzantine control, or at least local Byzantine rulers, local Christian rulers rather, because Persia historically struggled to hold regions with dense Christian populations. They could occupy them briefly, but holding them is a lot harder due to local resistance, not to mention the Byzantine counterattacks. And it's worth noting a geopolitical ripple too, by the way. You see, without the common Muslim enemy that emerged in our timeline, the age-old Greco-Persian rivalry might have simply resumed. But both powers learned hard lessons in the early 7th century. They might have opted to fortify a stable frontier and focus elsewhere. Byzantium, secure in Anatolia and the Balkans, might turn attention to Europe, or just its own internal affairs. Persia might turn eastward, or just consolidate what it has. Well, the next point we have is the possibility of alternate dynasties and state formation. You see, over centuries, even if the Middle East did stay Zoroastrian, dynastic changes would occur. The Sasanian line could eventually die out or be overthrown. Indeed, Yazdegerd III's descendants in China or India might not have had strong claims back home. Perhaps a powerful general or provincial noble could seize the throne, analogous to how in our history timeline, later Islamic empires often saw Turkic or local warlords to establish new dynasties. So one could imagine a Zoroastrian Persian general, like a historical Rustam or a fictitious strongman perhaps, founding a new dynasty around the 8th or 9th century. These new rulers would still legitimize themselves via Zoroastrian ideology and theology, maybe even claiming to be restorers of the pure faith, if any laxity had set in. Of course, the falling of dynasties and the rise of a new one could also be framed in the balance of evil and good. The old dynasty was Angramenyu, and the new one is Ahura Mazda. Well, next we talk about a bit of administration and law. Zoroastrian Persia would maintain much of the Sasanian administrative system. Bureaucracy staffed by scribes called Dibiran, a network of local nobility, Diazadan and Shars, who were feudal nobles and governors, and a corpus of law influenced by Zoroastrian jurisprudence. In fact, the Sasanians had compilations of civil and religious laws. The Book of 1,000 Judgments is an example of recorded jurisprudence from late Sasanian times. So without Islamic Sharia law taking over, the evolution of law would continue from these late antique roots. Religious courts of the Magi would handle family law, purity laws, etc., while secular judges, often the same elite, handled criminal and civil disputes in line with the king's edicts and customary law. And notably, some practices of Zoroastrian law were quite different from Islamic law. For example, close kin marriages were actually allowed, and in some periods even encouraged, in stark contrast to the Islamic prohibitions. Well, in an enduring Zoroastrian society, one might find cultural norms like consanguineous marriage persisting among certain noble families, and different inheritance rules. Zoroastrian law favored male inheritance, but also had prenuptial contracts for widows, etc. But then you could also assume with new scientific developments and all that, and what we know now about inbreeding, that this would eventually stop. Perhaps not via the law, but practical concerns would perhaps take over. Now next we have the concerns about religious minorities. Under continued Zoroastrian rule, how would the non-Zoroastrians fare? Well, that's where we have to look at the past performance. Historically, the Sasanian Empire alternated between tolerance and persecution, and it all depended on political necessity. For instance, Christians in Persia were sometimes persecuted, especially if Persia was at war with Byzantine Rome, a Christian power. There were episodes of severe persecution under certain kings. For example, Shapur II in the 4th century reacted harshly to Christians when Rome was hostile. But on the other hand, periods of peace saw relative tolerance, and by the late 6th century, there is evidence that Christians and even some Buddhists lived pretty happily in Persia, with Nestorian Christianity often even officially recognized to an extent. Well, in our alternative timeline, one could expect a similar pragmatic approach. Without Islam wiping out the Zoroastrian dominance, the Middle East's Christians, Jews, and others would still be second class under a Zoroastrian regime, but perhaps not as bad as it was under Muslim rule. It's just different. Sure, they might have had to pay an infidel tax of sorts. In Sasanian times there wasn't a standardized jizya, but non-Zoroastrians did pay higher taxes, or they didn't enjoy the same legal status. So there is that. Now the term al-Aldima would not exist, but a comparable concept of tolerated people of the book, especially Christians and Jews, might have been formalized. In fact, under Sasanian rule, Jews often fared pretty well, because they were not tied to Persia's main enemies. This could continue, possibly resulting in a larger Jewish presence in Babylon and Persia than occurred later under some stricter Muslim rulers. Now importantly, one difference. Zoroastrianism traditionally did not actively seek converts. It was ethically tied to Iranian identity to a large degree. That's ethnically, not ethically. Well, this does suggest that a Zoroastrian empire might not attempt to convert conquered peoples en masse, whereas Islam and Christianity have evangelical elements and often spread their faith to subject populations. Zoroastrians historically did very little of that beyond Iranian lands. That could mean that large swaths of the Middle East might actually not become Zoroastrian, even if ruled by Zoroastrians. For example, if Syria or Egypt remained under Persian control for that time, the local populace might remain Christian, similar to how the Greco-Roman pagans remained under the Persian occupation until liberated. The rulers might simply impose their elite religion, and perhaps expect some local nobles to adopt it for favor, but the common folk would perhaps stick to their traditions. Over centuries, though, without Islam as a competitor, Zoroastrianism might slowly spread by cultural influence or intermarriage, etc. Aramaic-speaking populations in Mesopotamia might gradually absorb into the Persian Zoroastrian culture, especially if there's a prestige attached to the state religion. But consider another political aspect, and that's the East Central Asia, and India. You see, in our real history, the Islamic conquest didn't just stop at Persia. It pushed into Central Asia, or Transoxiana as they call it, and into the Indian subcontinent of Sind. In a world where Persia stays Zoroastrian and strong, these areas might see a different dynamic. It is likely that Central Asia, the lands of Sogdia, Bactria, and beyond, would remain under Persian or local control and either Buddhist, Zoroastrian, or even Hindu in that region. Historically, Sogdians were Iranian peoples who practiced a mix of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and local faiths. That was until Islam gradually converted them by the 8th and 10th centuries and under Arab and later Turkic rule. But in our alternative timeline, perhaps it is that the Sogdian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara stay on the Iranian cultural sphere and maintain their older religious traditions for longer. Zoroastrianism could even gain a stronger foothold there if the Sasanian state survives and promotes it. And we know that by the 6th century, Sogdiana had Zoroastrian communities with no Islam. Those might flourish, or at least continue. As for India, Islam spread into India, starting with the Arab conquest of Sind in 711 and later Turkic invasions, might be vastly delayed or even prevented entirely. The northwestern subcontinent could remain predominantly Hindu or Buddhist. Interestingly, Persian Zoroastrian influence might increase in India through trade and migration. We might see more Zoroastrian refugees or even missionaries heading to India voluntarily, reinforcing Zoroastrian presence there. Historically, Parsis in India remained a small community, but in a scenario with a Zoroastrian great power right next door, perhaps more Persians would decide to settle in India. And, well, of course, they might proselytize among Indian, Iranic-speaking groups or others. It is conceivable, though, that some Indian kingdoms might syncretize or adopt elements of the Zoroastrian faith, especially in regions like Gujarat or Sindh, where contacts were quite close. And here we can actually note a real anecdote. Even in our proper timeline, the great Mughal Emperor Akbar in the 16th century, a Muslim ruler, was so fascinated by Zoroastrianism that he actually incorporated Zoroastrian sun worship rituals at his court, and even celebrated the Persian Nowruz. In an alternate timeline, such cultural cross-pollination might have started quite a bit earlier, with Zoroastrian Persia and Hindu India exchanging ideas freely. Now, the next thing is that there would be no Islamic Caliphate. But that doesn't mean that everyone's out of the woods yet. There's still a few new challenges. The absence of a caliphate does not mean perpetual peace. There was definitely wars before and after them. Other forces would certainly emerge. For example, Turkic nomads from Central Asia. In our history, many Turkic tribes converted to Islam and became instruments of Islamic empires like the Seljuks, the Ghaznavids, just to name two of them. But if Islam isn't dominant, those Turkic peoples might remain shamanistic, and some of them might remain Buddhist for a bit longer. But they could still migrate and invade settled lands. A Zoroastrian Persia in, say, the 10th and 11th centuries might face the onslaught of Turkic invasions similar to what happened historically. But perhaps these Turks would not be Muslim Ghazis. They might just be mercenaries or conquerors seeking wealth. They might end up adopting Zoroastrianism if they settled in Persia, or at least their kids would. Just as historically many Turks adopted the religion of the lands that they conquered. Think about Islam in the Middle East, Buddhism in China, stuff like that. It is quite conceivable that a powerful Turkic chief conquers parts of Persia, but then to legitimize his rule, he converts to Zoroastrianism, paralleling how a number of Turkic rulers in the Islamic world converted to Islam. Now that could reinvigorate Zoroastrian ranks with new adherents, and perhaps even militarize the faith. The Turkic Zoroastrian dynasty might emphasize the warrior aspect of the religion. Recall that Adur Gushnasp was the fire of warrior kings. And another eventual change is the Mongols in the 13th century. The Mongol Empire's rise would likely happen regardless of the Middle Eastern religious scene, since it originated far to the east. The Mongols were religiously eclectic. In real history, they initially practiced shamanism and then tolerated all religions. Some Khans later converted to Islam, but only after exposure. But in an alternate timeline, Mongol Khans coming into a Zoroastrian Persia might treat Zoroastrianism as just another tolerated faith, or perhaps even find its fire cult to be quite appealing. The Mongols respected fire in their shamanistic tradition too, you know. One could imagine a scenario where a Mongol Khan patronizes Zoroastrian temples to get some favor with his Persian subjects, rather than building mosques as in our timeline. And if the Mongols settle, they could conceivably convert. And historically, different branches did convert to Islam, Buddhism, or Christianity, depending on where they ruled. Certainly helps get the local population on your side. A Mongol-ruled Iran might see a late flowering of Zoroastrianism under Mongol patronage, as a part of keeping Persian administrators happy. So we can say, in summary, that politically the Middle East would feature a strong Persian and Zoroastrian imperial state instead of a caliphate, providing a kind of continuity with ancient empires. The absence of a unifying Islamic caliphate could mean more pluralism in power. Perhaps Byzantine Christians and Sasanian Zoroastrian realms remain co-equal superpowers for a little bit longer, with a patchwork of smaller kingdoms at their fringes, of course. But over the long run, as history marches into the second millennium, it's plausible that we'd see major powers and conquerors, Turkic and Mongol, but interacting with a Zoroastrian core in Iran, rather than an Islamic one. But here's one intriguing possibility. Without the early Islamic conquests fracturing it, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire might actually survive longer, or even thrive. The absence of the sudden loss of its Middle Eastern provinces could leave it stronger financially and demographically in the long run. A strong Christian empire in the west of the Middle East and a strong Zoroastrian empire in the east could have led to a very different balance of power by the medieval period. Perhaps no crusades would occur, because there's no need for a crusade if the Holy Land was still in Christian hands. Alternatively, if Persia had taken the Holy Land, crusades might be called by the Pope to free Jerusalem from Zoroastrian rule. Now, that's an unusual thought. It's hard to imagine, though, European knights charging to fight fire-worshipping Persians. But not impossible, given the religious fervor, I suppose. Europe's attitude toward a Zoroastrian Middle East would depend on how threatening it seemed. If Persia remained mostly in its historical boundaries, Europe would have probably just left it alone. And indeed, medieval Europeans knew Zoroaster's name from classical texts. Some Renaissance writers even respected Zoroastrianism as an ancient wisdom tradition. It's tantalizing to consider that Renaissance occultists and philosophers who were fascinated by Zoroaster, in our timeline they saw him as a bit of a sage, might have had actual contemporary Zoroastrian counterparts to dialogue with in this alternative world. So let's move on to our next section, we're going to just talk about religious and cultural life a little bit more at more the ground level. In a Middle East that stayed Zoroastrian, obviously the religious landscape in everyday cultural life would be dramatically different from the Islamic world we know. So let's paint a picture of how cities and societies might look and feel. The most immediate visual difference would be the skyline. Instead of minarets and domes of mosques dominating the city skylines, one would see Zoroastrian fire temples, Atash Behrams, and smaller Agieri temples, with their ever-burning fires. Historical accounts describe fire temples as often built on high platforms or hilltops, and the sacred flame was kept in an inner sanctum. So we might imagine large fire temple complexes in major cities like Ctesiphon, Babylon, Isfahan, or Re. These temples would likely be supported by the state and richly endowed as they were under the Sasanians. Priests, known as magi, would attend the fires in white robes and veils to avoid impurifying the flame with their breath. From outside, one might see the glow of holy fires at night, and perhaps the sounds of priests reciting the Yasna liturgy and the Gathas, Zoroastrian hymns, rather than the familiar Muslim call to prayer. The cultural rhythms would follow a different pattern. Instead of Fridays being a special for communal prayers, that is the Jummah, Zoroastrians would have had seasonal holy days and monthly feasts. Now the New Year, Nowruz, would be the supreme public holiday, likely celebrated with even greater pomp as a national Zoroastrian festival, featuring bonfires, feasting, and renewed rites. Already many Muslim-majority countries still celebrate Nowruz as a cultural festival, by the way, but in a Zoroastrian Middle East it would retain full religious significance, with masses visiting fire temples to give thanks every year. Now other festivals, like Mithra's festival, which is Meragan in autumn, and Tirgan summer, might also be widely celebrated, analogous to how Islamic Eid festivals function in our own timeline. And then there is the moral and social factors. Zoroastrian ethics encapsulated in the triad good thoughts, good words, good deeds would suffuse society. The public discourse might emphasize honesty and charity much as Islamic culture emphasizes piety and charity, but through a different theological lens. For example, charity in Islam is zakat, sadaqah, tied to the concept of helping the Ummah and pleasing God. But Zoroastrianism also encourages charity, but more as an individual virtue to fight greed, a manifestation of the evil spirit, that is. One famous quote attributed to Zoroaster is, quote, "Doing good to others is not a duty, it is a joy, for it increases your own health and happiness." Such a sentiment might be commonly taught. Perhaps community projects, feeding the poor during festivals, etc. Things like that would be seen as one's spiritual duty to promote Asha, truth and order. Now, truth-telling as a cardinal virtue might mean that oaths and contracts are taken extremely seriously. In Sasanian times, breaking an oath could be a grave sin, not to mention a crime. Culturally, this could foster a high-trust society internally, or at least if we're being very idealistic about it. Lying being not just immoral, but disgraceful, as Herodotus noted. Well, key Zoroastrian rituals that might be commonplace would be, for example, Yasna ceremonies in temples, involving the sacrifice of hauma or sacred liquor, and recitation of Avesta verses. Faravaha symbols, winged sun disk icons, representing divine glory and the human soul, adorning palaces and temples, much as the crescent or calligraphy of Quranic verses adorn buildings in Islamic culture in our own timeline. Funerary practices would remain quite distinct. Zoroastrians traditionally exposed corpses on dakmas, or towers of silence, to be cleaned by vultures, thus avoiding contaminating the earth or fire. Instead of vast Islamic cemeteries, cities might have walled enclosures with these circular stone towers where the dead are laid out. Now that would be a rather striking difference to any traveler from our timeline. Certainly, culture shocks abound with that one. In daily life, Zoroastrians also perform purity rituals frequently. For example, ritual washings, not unlike voodoo in Islam, but also the use of a sacred girdle that is untied and retied with prayers several times a day. We could expect to see people stopping to recite prayers while retying their girdle, especially at dawn, noon, and sunset, all part of the devotions. Next, there is the clergy and religious authority aspect. In the Islamic world, we had the development of the ulama, scholars, the muftis, the qadis, judges, and Sufi saints. In a Zoroastrian world, the religious leadership would revolve around the magi, a hereditary priestly class. High-ranking mobeds, or priests, and dasturs, high priests, would likely wield a significant amount of influence. Perhaps a chief mobed or a mobedan mobed akin to an archbishop could emerge as a counterpart to a caliph. Though Zoroastrianism does not have a single prophet's succession to manage, it does have the concept of an exalted priesthood. The priests might form councils to decide doctrinal matters, much as Islamic jurists held councils or Christian bishops had synods. They would interpret the Avesta and later commentaries, the Zend texts, to apply to current issues. And here's an interesting aspect. Zoroastrianism has a tradition of religious education and texts. The Avesta was transmitted orally for long, but then written in the late Sasanian era. And so we might see something like great library temples, where Zoroastrian manuscripts are copied and studied. Historically, the Academy of Gondeshapur under the Sasanians was a place where theology, including Zoroastrian theology, was studied alongside medicine and philosophy. Institutions like that might persist or multiply, making Persia an intellectual hub. More on science a little bit later. The absence of a centralized church, no equivalent of a pope or caliph that is, means that religious authority could be diffuse or collegial. Now possibly the fire temples of the three great fires, Adur Gushnap for warriors, Adur Farnbak for priests, and Adur Burzen Mir for farmers, would each have prestigious high priests, and a sort of council of high priests might coordinate religious norms across the empire. This scenario might have a parallel with how in our timeline Shiite Islam in Iran eventually had a clerical hierarchy that advised the ruler. In Zoroastrian Iran, powerful priests might advise the king and perhaps occasionally conflict if a king was impious. Heresy could also be an issue. Historically, Zoroastrianism saw sects like the Zurvanites or reformers like Mazdak, who preached proto-communist social reform in the late 5th century. In a long-lived Zoroastrian society, new sects or reform movements might emerge internally, leading to theological debates or even persecution of heterodox views by the Orthodox Magi. But how widespread would Zoroastrianism be among the populace? Well, in Sasanian times, most Persians and Medians were Zoroastrian, but Mesopotamia had a mix. Many Aramaic-speaking farmers were probably Christian or syncretic. And as noted, tolerance existed for others. If no conversion to Islam occurred, it is likely that Zoroastrianism remains the majority in Iran and perhaps parts of Central Asia, while Christianity remains dominant in the Levant and maybe Egypt, that is, unless Persia conquers them. Judaism would continue in its historic pockets. Babylonia had a pretty large Jewish community. They might even fare better and even longer without the disruptions of Islamic rule and the later restrictions in some periods. Eastern religions, too. Manichaeism might survive longer as well. It was harshly persecuted by both Rome and Persia, but with a different alignment of power. Maybe Mani's followers might find more refuge. Who knows? But here's one that I think is really fascinating, and that's the question of could Zoroastrianism have ever spread westward? You see, in our timeline, it did not really make significant converts among Greeks or others, though it undoubtedly influenced them on a conceptual level. But if Persia had political control over, let's say the Fertile Crescent for a bit longer, perhaps some Assyrians or Syrians would adopt Zoroastrianism too, especially if it was seen as a route to advancement. Excuse me. Well, there were certainly some Arab tribes that were Zoroastrian influenced. For example, some Arab clans in the pre-Islamic Iraq under Persian sway had begun worshipping Ahura Mazda alongside their own gods. Not quite Zoroastrian, but definitely on the right track. An enduring Zoroastrian empire might Iranianize parts of the Mesopotamia region fully, meaning that Aramaic culture gives way to Persian culture, and of course religion too over the centuries. By the High Middle Ages in this alternate world, we might find a Zoroastrian majority not just in Iran but also in Iraq, with fire temples present even in old Sumerian and Babylonian cities, coexisting alongside minority Christian monasteries and synagogues. Meanwhile, the Arabian Peninsula might remain largely pagan or Christian. Islam, if contained, might not flourish, or might evolve into another sect of monotheism with fewer adherents. Possibly Islam could have been stamped out in certain regions by the Persians, though that might be unlikely, unless they occupied Mecca. More likely it would survive but stagnate. Over centuries, it could even syncretize or maybe even mellow out a bit, perhaps becoming closer to a small Abrahamic sect akin to how Manichaeism or Mandaism were pretty niche. But next there's a huge cultural difference, and that's language influence. The Islamic conquest led to a widespread adoption of Arabic as the lingua franca of the Middle East, especially in religion and high culture, and the adoption of Arabic script for Persian and other languages. In our alternate scenario, Arabic would not have the same prestige beyond Arabia. Instead, Middle Persian or Pahlavi might continue to be the administrative and literary language of Iran, evolving eventually into New Persian, but written in a Pahlavi script, which is a script that's actually derived from Aramaic. Historically, after Islam, Persian was reborn using the Arabic script enriched with Arabic vocabulary, and without that influence, Persian would still evolve. All languages do, right? But it might retain more of its original vocabulary, or borrow from other sources, perhaps Aramaic, Sanskrit, or even Greek instead of Arabic. We could expect the Persian of, the 12th century Zoroastrian Iran to look more like a direct descendant of the Sasanian Pahlavi, maybe with some Greek terms for a new concept of things, given the ongoing contact with Byzantium or even Chinese terms if the Silk Road exchange was strong. Literature and scholarship would also take on a different bent. In our timeline, Islamic Persia produced masterpieces like Herodotus' Shahnameh, which consciously revived the pre-Islamic tales, and the poetic works of Hafez, Rumi, etc., which are deeply infused with Islamic Sufi imagery. But in an alternative timeline, a poet like Ferdowsi would still have his Shahnameh, but it wouldn't be a nostalgic revival. It would just be a mainstream epic, perhaps sponsored by the court to celebrate Zoroastrian kings. Persian poetry might go even more into Zoroastrian mystical ideas. We might see epic poems about Zoroaster himself, or elaborate mythologies around Ahura Mazda and their cosmic battle. Well, there was an actual corpus of Middle Persian literature, much lost due to conquest, that included legends, religious texts, and even romances. It's a shame we lost that one. But in the Zoroastrian Middle Ages, those texts, well, they could flourish, and new ones could be written. For example, instead of Omar Khayyam's quatrains skeptical of divine fate, we might have a Zoroastrian philosopher-poet writing about the Zoroastrian end-of-time renewal when good finally triumphs in lyrical forms. They call this the Frashokerti. And because Persian remains a prestigious language, neighboring peoples might adopt it as a second language too, similar to how Arabic became the language of learning from Spain to Central Asia in our lifetime. Well, we might have Zoroastrian Persian scholars writing in Persian and perhaps Greek, and others translating works into Persian rather than Arabic. The Syriac language, Aramaic dialect used by Middle Eastern Christians, might also remain significant as a bridge between Greek and Persian intellectual circles, just as it was in late antiquity. And one of the other big cultural shifts after Islam was in art. You see, Islamic art avoided figurative religious works, while Zoroastrian Persia had no such prohibition. In an alternate Middle East, figural representations in sacred art might be common. We might find royal statues, carvings of Zoroastrian angels called Yazata, and illustrated manuscripts with depictions of kings and heroes, as was common in pre-Islamic and later secular Persian art. Hell, we might even have the depictions of Zoroastrianism triumphing over Islam, with the Prophet Muhammad being at the pointy end of the stick. Who knows? In any case, the continuity of pre-Islamic artistic motifs, the regal investiture reliefs like the Tak-e-Bostan, showing Khosrow II receiving divine investiture from Ahura Mazda, or the iconic winged disc, they'd likely continue into later eras. By 1000 CE, Persian cities might have grand palaces with frescoes of legendary kings and Zoroastrian cosmological imagery, which in our timeline would have been replaced, or perhaps limited by aniconic designs. And then there's architecture. That would also reflect Zoroastrian themes. Fire temples often had a four-arched dome sanctuary called a Chahar Tak design. As architecture evolves, we might see ever more monumental fire temples, perhaps equivalents of cathedrals, with soaring halls where sacred fire is viewed from afar by worshippers. Persian architecture might blend with local styles. Imagine, for instance, an Egyptian Zoroastrian fire temple influenced by ancient Egyptian temple layouts, or a Syrian fire temple built around repurposing a former Byzantine church, if the conquests happened that way. Many Islamic architectural innovations, like the use of the dome, iwans, minarets, were actually continuations of earlier Persian and Byzantine ideas. In a non-Islamic context, they'd still likely emerge, but with different decoration. We could see minaret-like towers not called to prayer, but perhaps symbolic pillars of fire, maybe bell towers or platforms where at night a fire could be lit, symbolizing the faith for all to see. That sounds pretty nice, actually. Wouldn't that be cool? You're sitting in a Zoroastrian city, waiting for the evening fires to come alive. Yeah, that would be nice. Dare I say it would be a little bit romantic. Imagine taking a girl out on a date and you got a nice view of the fire temples coming out just as they're serving you your dinner. Ooh. Now that would be a good one. I think that would be nice, actually. Any case. Well, now we're really going into alternate timelines. In any case, continuing on, let's have a look at another cultural element. That's music and dress. Now, it's pretty obvious that Islamic norms led to particular dress codes and musical traditions. Zoroastrian Persia had its own musical heritage, and we have some records of court musicians too. Without Islamic influence discouraging certain artistic expression, Persian music might develop with even more continuity from ancient times, perhaps incorporating the old Zoroastrian devotional hymns. Attire might be less strictly regulated by religion. Islamic dress, especially for women, introduced veiling norms that were not as pronounced as before. Zoroastrian women in antiquity did wear veils in public on occasion, but the practice was not a universal religious law. It's plausible that in Zoroastrian societies, women's dress might be more similar to Sasanian fashions. Long robes, maybe light veils or headscarves as a cultural choice, but certainly not mandated by religious decree as hijab is in Islam. Society was patriarchal in both systems, but there are hints that Zoroastrian law gave women some property rights and participation in rituals. For example, women could be initiated in the faith, and even some roles in priestly families, though priesthood itself was male-dominated. Thus, the everyday social roles of women might have ended up somewhat different, perhaps more similar to the norms of late antiquity. Well, in our timeline, Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in concepts like angels, demonology, and eschatology. If Zoroastrianism remained vibrant and dominant, that cross-pollination could continue. We might see greater philosophical dialogue between Zoroastrian theologians and Christian ones. For instance, debates on dualism versus monotheism might occupy scholars. Early church fathers did write polemics against Zoroastrian dualism, but with a living Zoroastrian empire next door, the medieval Christian philosophers might engage more deeply. Perhaps some compromise theological ideas emerge, or heresies in Christianity that align more with Zoroastrian dualism. Think about something like a stronger notion of the devil's independent power, something Zoroastrianism essentially has might have gained traction in the West. And conversely, Zoroastrians might be challenged by Christian ideas of universalism and charity, potentially reforming some of their own practices. Think about it, for example, they might be inspired to be more proselytizing or more egalitarian, citing some Christian examples. Also, without Islam suppressing certain sects, heresies like Manichaeism or Mazdaism, well, they could have had a longer afterlife. Manichaeism, a fusion of Zoroastrianism, Christian and Gnostic ideas, was stamped out in the West by both Romans and Persians, but it survived in the East, even reaching China. So perhaps in a scenario where Persia is Zoroastrian and tolerant, Manichaeans might survive openly in some regions, adding to a pluralistic environment. The intellectual diversity might thus be even greater than in the Islamic Golden Age, albeit less unified by a single lingua franca. So we can say that the cultural atmosphere of a Zoroastrian Middle East might resemble a blend of late antiquity Persian life extended into the medieval era. Fire temple worship, ethical dualism, and Persian cultural motives would provide continuity, while interactions with neighboring Christian, Hindu, and other traditions would create a rich tapestry of art and thought. It's a world where one might travel from Constantinople with its churches to Ctesiphon with its fire shrines, to Benares with its Hindu temples along the Silk Road, encountering a variety of devotions, rather than the more uniformly Islamic character that prevailed from Spain to Central Asia in our time. The House of Submission, Islam that is, might be replaced by what we call a House of Majesty, borrowing the term Persian Empire, Iran Shah, where a Huda master's perceived majesty underpins that great social order. Well, let's talk about economics and technology, because that's a pretty big area too. Well, in those realms, the Zoroastrian Middle East might develop along different lines, though certain underlying factors might remain the same, things like geography, resources. So let's consider trade, science, and ultimately urbanization. First, the Middle East's central position in Afro-Eurasian trade would still be capitalized on, but without the unifying umbrella of the Caliphate, trade might be more regionally segmented or competitive. Historically, the early Islamic caliphates facilitated a vast free trade zone from Spain to the Indus, using a common language, Arabic, and a common currency, which of course generally aided commerce quite a lot. In the alternate scenario, Persia and Byzantium would form two large economic spheres. Trade would flow along the Silk Road through Persian territories as it did before, and indeed, Persian merchants, often of various faiths including Zoroastrians and others, were prominent on the Silk Road in antiquity and, well, would remain so. The Sasanian Empire had already been a key intermediary for silk, spices, and other goods between East and West. That likely continues, potentially even more efficiently, if the empire stabilizes after repelling invaders. However, maritime trade, that might see differences. The Arab seafarers after Islam were instrumental in connecting the Indian Ocean trade to the Middle East. Muslim merchants reached East Africa, India, Southeast Asia, China. And before Islam, Persian and Indian traders were doing this too, though perhaps on a smaller scale. In a scenario with no Islamic expansion, Persian and Indian and possibly Ethiopian sailors might continue to dominate the Indian Ocean routes. Ports in the Persian Gulf like Siraf or Charax would remain quite busy. Possibly they get even busier as they wouldn't face the turmoil of conquest. Chinese and Persian relations could flourish. Historically, the Tang dynasty of China had diplomatic ties with the Sasanian Persians, and even sheltered Persian nobles after the Arab conquest. In a timeline where Persia never fell, Tang China and its successors might engage in robust commerce and exchange with the Persian Empire. And it'd be good business too. The Tang dynasty in China was certainly the golden age. So we could imagine Persian envoys at the Chinese court, Chinese envoys at the Persian court, sharing inventions and knowledge. Maybe even gunpowder or printing technology travels to the West earlier via Persia. That could make a difference. Meanwhile, Europe. Without the Islamic blockade of the Eastern Mediterranean, the 7th and 8th centuries, Eastern Roman or Byzantine control of the seas might have persisted. Byzantine and Italian merchants could trade more directly with the Zoroastrian Near East. The Venetian and Genoese traders, who in our timeline had to navigate through Muslim intermediaries, might in this alternative world deal with Persian Zoroastrian merchants in Levantine ports, or even Persian Gulf ports. It is possible that this could accelerate certain exchanges. For instance, commodities like paper, spices, and silk might reach Europe via Persia and Byzantium trade routes in different patterns. Then there's the other hand. Competition between a Christian West and Zoroastrian Persians might sometimes hamper relations if trade sours. Well, next we have urban development. Major cities like Ctesiphon, Baghdad, which might not be founded as Baghdad by a caliph in this world, but the site on the Tigris could still host a city, that's for sure. Then there's Damascus, Isfahan, and others, would evolve under continuous Persian rule. We might not see a founding of Baghdad in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, but perhaps a Persian king might establish a new capital or even refurbish an old one. The Sasanians had multiple capital cities. Ctesiphon was primary, but they also had a winter capital at Persepolis. It's plausible that they might continue using Ctesiphon near modern Baghdad as the imperial seat, meaning Mesopotamia remains the heart of the empire. That region's agriculture, the Tigris-Euphrates irrigation, would continue to be maintained by Persian bureaucracy. Historically, the Islamic Conquest and subsequent neglect warfare led to some decay of the ancient irrigation networks in Iraq, contributing to its agricultural decline. Maybe, under a stable Zoroastrian regime, Mesopotamian agriculture would be better sustained, possibly leading to higher population and prosperity there through medieval period than what occurred in under some later caliphates. Now, also the destruction of the absence of destructive early Islamic wars in the Fertile Crescent could preserve cities like Antioch, Aleppo, and Alexandria from the damage that they suffered, at least initially. If Persia doesn't conquer them, assuming Byzantium holds them as well, those cities could continue under Byzantine rule and flourish quite well. So the urban landscape might remain more Roman in the west and more Persian in the east, rather than an Arab Islamic character imprinting everywhere. But one of the most intriguing aspects lies in science and knowledge. The real Islamic Golden Age, through the 8th to 12th centuries, was characterized by the translation movement. Greek scientific and philosophical works were translated into Arabic, often from Syriac or Persian, and scholars in the Abbasid realm made advances in algebra, astronomy, medicine, etc. So what if that impetus had occurred under Zoroastrian Persian patronage instead? In fact, pre-Islamic Persia had already begun such a project. The famous academy of Gondeshapur in Khuzestan, southwest Iran, was a renowned institution in late Sasanian times, where Greek, Indian, and Persian knowledge intermingled. It had a teaching hospital and a medical school, possibly the world's first of its kind, and scholars there translated works from Sanskrit into Syriac and Persian. For example, under Khosrow I, the game of chess and Indian fables, later known as Kalilawadima, were brought from India and translated into Persian. If Persia remained independent, Gondeshapur could have continued as the premier intellectual center, perhaps expanding with satellite institutions in other cities. Who knows? Probably, though. What we could see is a translation movement into Middle Persian instead of Arabic. Now, Greek philosophy, so think about Plato, Aristotle, Galen, etc., for the medical side of things, might be translated by bilingual Syriac-speaking scholars into Pahlavi or, later on, New Persian. Indian mathematics and astronomy would also likely be translated, as there was already interest. The Persian court invited Indian astronomers and physicians, by the way. The result could be a burst of scientific activity paralleling what we know, but the language of science might become Persian rather than Arabic. Now, interestingly, New Persian is an Indo-European language, and it's actually closer to Sanskrit and Latin in its structure than Arabic is. And some historians speculate that having a Semitic language, Arabic, take on Greek science required heavy borrowing of terminology. Now, if Persian were the medium, perhaps slightly fewer neologisms would be needed, as Persian could adapt or revive cognate words. But that's a linguistics aside. In any case, the knowledge transfer from antiquity to the medieval world would still happen by the Persians, and perhaps via the Byzantines directly. Well, we might find famous scholars analogous to real ones. For example, instead of al-Khwarizmi, or Khwarizmi, that was the Persian Muslim mathematician who pioneered algebra, by the way. He was writing in Arabic, but we might have a Zoroastrian mathematician, Khwarizm-Dad, fictional name, of course, could be writing in Persian, developing algebraic methods from Indian sources. The word algebra itself comes from the Arabic algebra, from al-Khwarizmi. Wow, I'm really having trouble with that one. You just got to slow down. Al-Khwarizmi. There we go. From Al-Khwarizmi's book. I hope that doesn't come back up again. Well, in Persian, perhaps it would be called Pardazish, or something a little bit more local. Similarly, famous physicians like Ibn Sina and Al-Razi were Persian by ethnicity. They might still exist in this scenario, but would be Zoroastrian court physicians, writing their medical encyclopedias in Persian. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine could thus be a Persian text blending Greek and Persian healing lore, used across the Zoroastrian world. And then there's astronomy. That would be highly esteemed, as Zoroastrianism attached importance to stars and the calendar. We could see even earlier development of sophisticated astronomical tables to reform the calendar. In fact, in our timeline, Omar Khayyam, a Muslim Persian, reformed the Iranian calendar in the 11th century, creating one that was actually more accurate than the Julian calendar. In an alternative timeline, a Zoroastrian astronomer might do likewise, perhaps connecting it to even more religious festivals. Alchemy and chemistry might also develop. Interestingly, a lot of early Islamic alchemists were Persian or syncretic, like Jabir ibn Hayyan, though somewhat mythical. But under Zoroastrian auspices, interest in the properties of metals and purification could be framed in terms of the cosmic battle of good versus evil. So finding order in nature through science might be seen as almost a religious duty, bringing knowledge, a form of light, into the world to combat ignorance. Now, certain technologies spread by the Islamic world would instead be spread through Persia or other routes. For example, paper making, historically learned by Muslims from Chinese in the 8th century. And if Persia remained central, Persian merchants, or perhaps a war if Persians had clashed with Turks or Chinese, could lead to capturing Chinese paper makers. bringing paper to Persia. A Persian paper-making industry might spring up in Samarkand or Ctesiphon, leading to a manuscript culture just as rich as the Islamic one, and this would facilitate wider literacy among the administrative class and clergy. Of course, with paper comes printing, without the religious opposition from Islam, which was ambivalent to printing initially due to calligraphy traditions. Perhaps printing could be adopted earlier in Persia once it becomes known from China. However, Zoroastrians too have holy scriptures that they might hesitate to reproduce cheaply due to purity concerns, so it's not quite certain. But you can imagine printed Zoroastrian prayer books by the late medieval period, which could spread the religion further. Then there's navigation. The astrolabe was developed classically and improved by Muslims. Persian astronomers could likewise improve navigation tools. If anything, being Zoroastrian doesn't hinder science. It might even encourage study of the stars, since stars were considered divine creations aiding navigations. In Zoroastrian texts, stars are part of the good creation fighting the darkness. And as noted, Gondishapur's medical knowledge mixing Greek humorism and Indian Ayurveda might produce interesting results. Perhaps alternate medical texts unify these traditions differently than Ibn Sina's canon did. If more Sanskrit medical knowledge comes via direct links to India, Persian medicine could incorporate surgery techniques, herbal knowledge, and so on. Well, next we have the realm of agriculture. The Islamic world benefited from what historians call the Islamic Green Revolution. New crops, farming techniques, diffused across the Caliphate. Think about sugarcane, cotton, citrus, rice in new areas. In a Persian-led world, such diffusions would still occur, but maybe not as uniformly. Persians already cultivated some of those. They knew sugar, cotton, etc. And they might introduce certain crops to Mesopotamia and beyond, similarly through trade. If Egypt stays under Byzantium, some crops might not go there as soon. But overall, trade being active means new crops still spread. For example, rice and sugar were grown in Khuzestan in Iraq in the late Sasanian times, and likely would again, making those provinces rich. And then there's coffee. What would we do without it? Which in our world spread from Ethiopia and Yemen to the Islamic world around the 15th century. Well, that might not become as big without the social coffeehouse culture in the Ottoman and Arab world. Of course, when they stopped drinking alcohol, they had to drink something, right? Perhaps Zoroastrian Persians might prefer wine. Indeed, wine was pretty big in ancient Persia. No Islamic prohibition on alcohol to stop that. Sorry about my neighbor smashing the door closed, and he always does that. I don't know why people do that. They just slam their own doors closed. I think he does it on purpose. Perhaps if he was Zoroastrianism, if he was Zoroastrian, he might close the door gently, who knows? Well, back to our own timeline. In any case, viticulture in places like Iran and Syria would continue unabated, maybe producing famous vintages enjoyed at Nowruz feasts, whereas in our timeline, wine production diminished in the Middle East due to Islamic restrictions, except among Christians. In the alternative timeline, a flourishing wine trade could exist. The ancient Persians were known to enjoy wine. They even had a ritual of discussing important matters twice, once drunk and once sober, to see if both states agreed on the decision. And could you imagine if we had famous wine brands or famous beers from Iran or Afghanistan or Egypt? Now that would be certainly a different timeline. maybe in an alternate universe. But we have to note, right, that the absence of Islam might actually mean that some technologies enter Europe slower in some cases. For instance, Arabic numerals from India revolutionized math in Europe, and they came via Islamic Spain and the Crusaders. If Persia held that knowledge, would it reach Europe? Yeah, maybe. Possibly via trade, or via Byzantium. Byzantium scholars might pick it up from Persians and pass it to the Europeans. Or maybe Persians themselves trade scientific books to the West. Imagine Persian embassies gifting treatises to Carolingian kings. There could be a delay, or maybe an alternative path. But critical inventions like numerals, algebra, etc., which wouldn't be called algebra because they wouldn't have the Arabic algebra, it would be called something else. I don't know, something Zoroastrian. I don't even know what algebra is, to be honest with you. Don't ask me. Well, these things would likely still spread because the underlying connections remain. You see, the world is still interconnected by trade routes, of course. Now, Europe might end up interacting more with a Christian Byzantium for knowledge. So perhaps Europe's Renaissance could even start earlier, or differently, sparked by Byzantine Greek influence instead of Arabic and Andalusian sources. If Byzantium is not smashed by Arabs and later Turks, it might preserve classical knowledge even more. So ironically, Europe might rely more on Greek texts directly rather than Arabic translations to rediscover Aristotle. And this could make the Renaissance more gradual, Byzantine-influenced process, rather than a sudden 12th century Toledo transition-style event. Well, economically, Persia remaining wealthy, controlling Mesopotamia and trade, could also mean it remains a prize for invaders. And think about the Mongols, for instance. They would still be drawn to the wealth of a fertile, populous Iran and Iraq. If the Mongols still devastate the region in the 13th century, a lot of this progress could be set back, similarly to how it happened historically. Mongol conquests didn't care if the region was Muslim or Zoroastrian. They were equal opportunity devastators. However, if Persia had a stronger state and perhaps stronger alliances, maybe even with Europe, they might have been able to deter the Mongols. Who knows? Maybe some invasions could be mitigated. Maybe they would have teamed up against them. Who knows? Overall, the Middle Eastern economy might remain one of the most advanced in the world through the Middle Ages, as it indeed was under Islam. But here it would be credited to a continuity of ancient Persian commercial and scholarly spirit, rather than the new Islamic order. Now for the last part, we're just going to talk about the political ripple effects. Now zooming out to broader geopolitics, if the Middle East stayed Zoroastrian, and by extension, Islam as a world religion was significantly reduced, localized, or even just eliminated completely, the ripple effects across Afro-Eurasia would be very profound. Now we've touched on a few in passing, but let's summarize a few key ones. First of all, Christian and Islamic conflict would be averted, or perhaps replaced. Much of the medieval geopolitical tension was cast as a Christian Europe versus the Muslim world. Think about the Crusades, the Reconquista in Spain, the Ottoman Wars in the Balkans. Well, in a scenario with no powerful Muslim presence, the Crusades as we know them wouldn't happen, because the Holy Land might still be under a Christian Byzantine power or perhaps Zoroastrian Persian control. The Pope called the First Crusade to help Byzantium and reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims, to stop all the pilgrims from being slaughtered on their way to the Holy Land by Islamic forces. Now if, say, Jerusalem were in Byzantine hands, no need to reclaim, or even in Persian hands, who were perhaps more gentle to the pilgrims, well, the appeal would be different. It is possible that a pope could frame a crusade against Zoroastrian fire worshippers, calling them pagans and saying that we don't want them in the Christian holy sites, but the optics are a bit different, and it's a bit harder of a sell, to be honest. The Eastern Church would probably prefer negotiation with Persia over handing sites to Latin crusaders. But alternatively, if Byzantium is strong and holds its territory, Western Europe might never get the indulgence-fueled fervor to march east at all. And then there's Spain and Western Europe. You see, in our timeline, the Muslim Moors conquered much of Spain in the 8th century and held it hostage for centuries, profoundly influencing Spanish culture too. The architecture, language, science, it's all mixed in. Now, without Islam expanding, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain would not fall that way. Perhaps Spain remains a Germanic Christian kingdom, or breaks into smaller states, but in any case, there's no Al-Andalus to be heard of. And this means that there's no transmission of Arabic learning via Cordova, etc. However, that learning would exist in a Persian context and possibly trickle to Europe via other routes as discussed. Now, culturally, Spain and the Mediterranean might stay more aligned with Latin Christendom. No centuries of Arabic language overlay, though some interactions might fill the gap. Now, the Ottoman Empire, which of course Muslim, took Constantinople in 1453 and dominated the Balkans. Without a large Muslim Turkish state, the Byzantine Empire might live longer, maybe even indefinitely. Hey, it might still be around. We might still be calling Istanbul Constantinople. A lot of people still do that anyway. I think in Romania they still call it Constantinople. Bit of an old grudge between them, I suppose. Good on them. We can all start calling it Constantinople again, maybe. Who knows? I've not been yet. I really want to go, though. Sorry, I'm getting off topic. In any case, perhaps a different power might take its place. Maybe a Slavic Christian empire. Or even the Persians if they ever went that far, but that's a bit far-fetched. The Balkans would remain largely Orthodox Christian, as historically. But without Ottoman rule, maybe they'd develop differently. Maybe fewer forced conversions to Islam in Bosnia or Albania, for example, so those stay Christian too. Now, on to North Africa. You see, North Africa was already Christian, mostly Orthodox or Donatist, and this was before Islam even came around. Well, it became mostly Muslim after. In a no-Islam scenario, North Africa likely remains Christian, and culturally tied to Latin or Coptic churches, or possibly falls under Persian sway for a time. Persians did briefly invade Egypt in the early 7th century, by the way. I think I mentioned that before. Well, if Persia didn't push that far, North Africa might be a mix of indigenous Berber culture and Christianity, with maybe some influence from sub-Saharan trade, but Islam historically facilitated the trans-Saharan trade and conversion. Without it, perhaps Christianity or local beliefs persist in West Africa longer too. The Ethiopian Christian kingdom, which in real history remained an isolated Christian outpost surrounded by Islam, might have much more influence if its neighbors were not Muslim. Perhaps Ethiopia would spread Coptic Christianity more along the Red Sea coast, or even interact with the Zoroastrian South Arabia, if that happened. Well, in our world, Islam spread to what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan, and across Central Asia, often by the sword, and later by Sufi missionaries. But without that, Buddhism and Hinduism remained dominant in those regions. Afghanistan, for instance, was a mix of Buddhist and Zoroastrian influence pre-Islam, and it might stay that way, or become more firmly Zoroastrian if Persian power reasserts. The Turkic peoples of Central Asia might remain shamanistic Buddhist or Nestorian Christian, as some were, instead of converting to Islam. Now this means the demographics of places like, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc. would be quite different. Perhaps more Buddhist, or even Zoroastrian if influenced by Persia. The Silk Road cities could become melting pots of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity without a single faith dominating them. But then, of course, there's the Mongol conquests, which certainly upsets the apple cart. They could lead to interesting outcomes. Historically, Mongols often adopted the religion of the majority in a region, Islam in Persia, Buddhism in China. In an alternative timeline, Mongol rulers of Persia might find Zoroastrianism as the majority faith and possibly convert to, or at least patronize it. We could have seen a Mongol Khan become Zoroastrian and promote it, which would be a dramatic twist. Imagine a Khan declaring Ahura Mazda is to be worshipped across his dominion. That would be interesting. And then without Islam, of course, there is no Ottoman Sultanate as we know it. The Turks might form states, but likely less unified. Maybe a Turco-Persian Zoroastrian empire could form in the later centuries, but its character would be quite different. It might be more feudal, less theocratic than the Ottoman structure, since Zoroastrianism lacks a concept of caliphate or sultan as defender of the faith. The king is divine, yes, but the religion is also ethnic. Well, let's look at some global colonization concerns and a little bit beyond. By the time we reach the age of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Zoroastrian Middle East would have presented European powers with a different set of partners and rivals. Let me explain. European explorers like Vasco da Gama, who sailed to India and encountered Muslim-ruled port cities. In an alternative world, they would find Zoroastrian-ruled port cities or Hindu ones. A Portuguese voyager arriving in, say, 1500 to the Persian Gulf might negotiate trade with a Zoroastrian Persian emperor, rather than a Safavid Muslim Shah. Perhaps relations would be less immediately adversarial since religion might not divide them as sharply. Christian Europeans often had hostility with Muslim states, but with Zoroastrians they might feel more curiosity, or see them just as exotic fire worshippers rather than scriptural enemies. There were legends in medieval Europe about the Magi of the East, from the biblical story of the wise men, from the East of Jesus' birth, often linked with Persian astrologers. Europeans might interpret Zoroastrians through that lens and attempt to missionize them. That's another heathen group, perhaps, or even ally with them against common foes if, say, a Mongol or another empire threatened them both. Colonization in places like the Indian subcontinent would face a different religious mix. No large Muslim Mughal empire, which in our timeline was a formidable state that the British dealt with. Instead, maybe a powerful Hindu empire, like the Marathas or Rajput, or even a Persian-oriented Zoroastrian dynasty in the northwest. European colonial strategy might change accordingly. It's conceivable that a Zoroastrian Persia might itself attempt exploration, though historically, Persians were not a major sea-going people, at least not beyond the Indian Ocean. If they maintained a strong mercantile tradition, perhaps they could have contested European influence in the Indian Ocean, more robustly than the fragmented post-Mughal states did at least. Now back in the Americas, the absence of an expansive Dar al-Islam doesn't directly change things initially, but over time the lack of a Turkish threat or Barbary pirates might free European powers to focus elsewhere. Or the presence of a strong Persian empire might mean that European powers consider alliances with it against Russia or others in the Great Game era. For instance, a Zoroastrian Persian empire in the 18th to 19th centuries might have aligned with Britain or France at times, or tried to modernize without the religious conservatism that Islamic clerics at the time had. On the other hand, Zoroastrian priests might have also tried to resist westernization, but that's a little hard to predict. Now here's one surprising detail to note. Even after centuries of decline, Zoroastrian influences quietly persisted in the Islamic world. For example, many Persian Muslims continued celebrating Nowruz, the Zoroastrian New Year, and incorporate ancient Persian iconography in art. In our ultimate timeline, these influences wouldn't really need to hide. They'd be right out there in the open in the mainstream. The intellectual heritage of ancient Persia, which included ideas possibly passed to the West, like the concept of guardian angels, heaven, hell, and final judgment, might have been even more directly transmitted to Western thought if Zoroastrianism remained a living, conversant tradition. Well, perhaps Enlightenment thinkers would have dialogues not just with deists and Muslims and Hindus as they did, but with Zoroastrian priests who would present a very unique dualistic theology. Now finally, consider the modern world map. Likely a nation-state of Persia or Iran would exist, but it might be larger if it had retained more territory, perhaps holding Iraq or parts of Central Asia. It would presumably be officially Zoroastrian, maybe akin to how some European states were officially Protestant or Catholic, but possibly more pluralistic due to the nature of the faith's interaction with others. The absence of a large Islamic bloc might mean the concept of Islamic terrorism or a certain 20th century geopolitical issue simply never arises. Instead, though, we might have other tensions, perhaps nationalist or between Christianity and other ideologies. It's really hard to say. One could really speculate endlessly on it. But to conclude the video for today, take a little thought experiment. A Middle East that stayed Zoroastrian would have been one where the torch of an ancient Persian civilization continued burning brightly through the medieval era, shining a different path for global history. The flame of Ahura Mazda, tended by generations of magi, might have guided the region's development as much as the creed of Islam did in our reality. Yet, with a distinctive ethos of a dualistic struggle for good, royal divinity, and cultural continuity from Cyrus and Darius, all the way to modern times. Ah, the road not taken. Certainly is interesting though, isn't it? This video was not meant to be as long as it was. Originally I thought it was just going to be the usual 1 hour job. But the topic is just far too interesting. I think it's interesting. And I'm sure if you're still listening, you think it's interesting. In any case, I did a 3-hour long video on Zoroastrianism before. This was maybe 6 months ago. Something like that. And it did quite well. People seemed to be quite fascinated with the topic. So I wanted to make this one, and, well, we wanted to get together and sort it all out and Oh, it took a long time to sort it out, believe me. But here we are anyway, and we had lots of fun. Now, speaking of fun, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters, which I do at the end of every video, you know. Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, where are we? Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ophir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Jill, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Calvary, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig. Sorry for clearing my throat so much today. I must be getting over something. Where was I? Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazarkin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, and Big Gun 101. Cool. All right, everyone. Well, it was a long video, but we enjoyed it, so I really need to rest my voice now. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something, or at least had a good rest. Perhaps you're dreaming about the Zoroastrian world. Lots of love to you all. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video. Farewell for now.